Welcome to this compilation of sci-fi short stories about incredible worlds. I'll be narrating The Anglers of Arz by Roger D., The God Next Door by Bill Doede, Spawning Ground by Lester Del Rey, and Survival Factor by Charles V. DeVette. If you aren't already aware, recent monetization issues on YouTube have led me to move most of my stories over to Substack for a more stable environment. If you'd like to keep up with all the latest releases, go over there and subscribe for no cost, and if you'd like to contribute further, that would be greatly appreciated. The link is storiesfromthesky.sff.substack.com. Click in the description. For now, let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Anglers of Arz by Roger D. Narrated by William Sky. In order to make Isaac Walton's sport complete, there must be an angler, a fish, and some bait. All three existed on Arz, but there was a question as to which was which. The third night of the Marco IV's landfall on the moonless Altarian planet was a repetition of the two before it, a 9-hour intermission of drowsy pastoral peace. Navigator Arthur Farrell, it was his turn to stand watch, was sitting at an open side port with a magnoscanner ready, but in spite of his vigilance he had not exposed a film when the inevitable pre-dawn rainbow began to shimmer over the eastern ocean. Sunrise brought him alert with a jerk, frowning at sight of two pinkish bipedal Arzian fishermen posted on the tiny coral islet a quarter-mile offshore, their blank triangular faces turned stolidly toward the beach. "They're at it again," Farrell called and dropped to the mossy turf outside. "Roll out on the double. I'm going to magnafilm this." Stryker and Gibson came out of their sleeping cubicles reluctantly, belting on the loose shorts which all three wore in the balmy Arzian climate. Stryker blinked and yawned as he let himself through the port, his fringe of white hair tousled and his naked paunch sweating. He looked, Farrell thought for the 1000th time, more like a retired cook than like the veteran commander of a Terran colonies expedition. Gibson followed, stretching his powerfully muscled body like a wrestler to throw off the effects of sleep. Gibson was linguist-ethnologist of the crew, a blocky man in his early 30s with thick black hair and heavy eyebrows that shaded a square, humorless face. "Any sign of the squids yet?" he asked. "They won't show up until the dragons come," Farrell said. He adjusted the light filter of the magnoscanner and scowled at Stryker. "Lee, I wish you'd let me break up the show this time with a disbeam. This butchery gets on my nerves." Stryker shielded his eyes with his hands against the glare of sun on water. "You know I can't do that, Arthur. These Arzians may turn out to be fifth-order beings or higher, and under Terran regulations our tampering with what may be a basic culture pattern would amount to armed invasion. We'll have to crack that cackle and grunt language of theirs and learn something of their mores before we can interfere." Farrell turned an irritable stare on the incurious group of Arzians gathering nets and fishing spears in hand at the edge of the sheltering bramble forest. "What stumps me is their motivation," he said. "Why do the fools go out to that islet every night when they must know damned well what will happen next morning?" Gibson answered him with an older problem, his square face puzzled. "For that matter, what became of the city I saw when we came in through the stratosphere? It must be a tremendous thing, yet we've searched the entire globe in the Scouter and found nothing but water and a scattering of little islands like this one, all covered with bramble. It wasn't a city these pink fishers could have built either. The architecture was beyond them by 1,000,000 years." Stryker and Farrell traded baffled looks. The city had become something of a fixation with Gibson, and his dogged insistence, coupled with an irritating habit of being right, had worn their patience thin. "There never was a city here, Gib," Stryker said. "You dozed off while we were making planetfall, that's all." Gibson stiffened resentfully, but Farrell's voice cut his protest short. "Get set! Here they come!" Out of the morning rainbow dropped a swarm of winged lizards, 20 feet in length and a glistening chlorophyll green in the early light. They stooped like hawks upon the islet offshore, burying the two Arzian fishers instantly under their snapping, threshing bodies. Then, around the outcrop, the sea boiled whitely, churned to foam by a sudden uprushing of black octopoid shapes. "The squids," Stryker grunted. "Right on schedule. 2 seconds too late, as usual, to stop the slaughter." A barrage of barbed tentacles lashed out of the foam and drove into the melee of winged lizards. The lizards took the air at once, leaving behind 3 of their number who disappeared under the surface like harpooned seals. No trace remained of the 2 Arzian natives. "A neat example of dog-eat-dog," Farrell said, snapping off the magnoscanner. "Do any of those beauties look like city builders, Gib?" Chattering pink natives straggled past from the shelter of the thorn forest, ignoring the Earthmen, and lined the casting ledges along the beach to begin their day's fishing. "Nothing we've seen yet could have built that city," Gibson said stubbornly. "But it's here somewhere and I'm going to find it. Will either of you be using the scouter today?" Stryker threw up his hands. "I've a mountain of data to collate, and Arthur is off duty after standing watch last night. Help yourself, but you won't find anything." The scouter was a speeding dot on the horizon when Farrell crawled into his sleeping cubicle a short time later, leaving Stryker to mutter over his litter of notes. Sleep did not come to him at once. A vague sense of something overlooked prodded irritatingly at the back of his consciousness, but it was not until drowsiness had finally overtaken him that the discrepancy assumed definite form. He recalled then that on the first day of the Marco's planetfall, one of the pink fishers had fallen from a casting ledge into the water and had all but drowned before his fellows pulled him out with extended spear shafts. Which meant that the fishers could not swim, else some would surely have gone in after him. And the Marco's crew had explored Arz exhaustively without finding any slightest trace of boats or of boat landings. The train of association completed itself with automatic logic, almost rousing Farrell out of his doze. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "No boats, and they don't swim. Then how the devil do they get out to that islet?" He fell asleep with the paradox unresolved. Stryker was still humped over his records when Farrell came out of his cubicle and broke a packaged meal from the food locker. The Visicom over the control board hummed softly, its screen blank on open channel. "Gibson found his lost city yet?" Farrell asked, and grinned when Stryker snorted. "He's scouring the daylight side now," Stryker said. "Arthur, I'm going to ground Gib tomorrow, much as I dislike giving him a direct order. He's got that phantom city on the brain, and he lacks the imagination to understand how dangerous to our assignment an obsession of that sort can be." Farrell shrugged. "I'd agree with you offhand if it weren't for Gib's bull-headed habit of being right. I hope he finds it soon, if it's here. I'll probably be standing his watch until he's satisfied." Stryker looked relieved. "Would you mind taking it tonight? I'm completely bushed after today's logging." Farrell waved a hand and took up his magnoscanner. It was dark outside already, the close, soft night of a moonless tropical world whose moist atmosphere absorbed even starlight. He dragged a chair to the open port and packed his pipe, settling himself comfortably while Stryker mixed a nightcap before turning in. Later he remembered that Stryker dissolved a tablet in his glass, but at the moment it meant nothing. In a matter of minutes the older man's snoring drifted to him, a sound faintly irritating against the velvety hush outside. Farrell lit his pipe and turned to the inconsistencies he had uncovered. The Arzians did not swim, and without boats. It occurred to him then that there had been 2 of the pink fishes on the islet each morning, and the coincidence made him sit up suddenly, startled. Why 2? Why not 3 or 4 or only 1? He stepped out through the open lock and paced restlessly up and down on the springy turf, feeling the ocean breeze soft on his face. 3 days of dull, routine log work had built up a need for physical action that chafed his temper. He was intrigued and at the same time annoyed by the enigmatic relation that linked the Arzian fishes to the dragons and squids, and his desire to understand that relation was aggravated by the knowledge that Arz could be a perfect world for Terran colonization. That is, he thought wryly, if Terran colonists could stomach the weird custom pursued by its natives of committing suicide in pairs. He went over again the improbable drama of the past 3 mornings, and found it not too unnatural until he came to the motivation and the means of transportation that placed the Arzians in pairs on the islet, when his whole fabric of speculation fell into a tangled snarl of inconsistencies. He gave it up finally. How could any Earthman rationalize the outlandish compulsions that actuated so alien a race? He went inside again, and the sound of Stryker's muffled snoring fanned his restlessness. He made his decision abruptly, laying aside the magnoscanner for a hand flash and a pocket-sized Audicom unit, which he clipped to the belt of his shorts. He did not choose a weapon because he saw no need for one. The torch would show him how the natives reached the outcrop, and if he should need help, the Audicom would summon Stryker. Investigating without Stryker's sanction was, strictly speaking, a breach of Terran regulations, but... "Damn Terran regulations," he muttered. "I've got to know." Farrell snapped on the torch at the edge of the thorn forest and entered briskly, eager for action now that he had begun. Just inside the edge of the bramble, he came upon a pair of Arzians curled up together on the mossy ground, sleeping soundly, their triangular faces wholly blank and unrevealing. He worked deeper into the underbrush and found other sleeping couples, but nothing else. There were no humming insects, no twittering night birds or scurrying rodents. He had worked his way close to the center of the island without further discovery, and was on the point of turning back, disgusted, when something bulky and powerful seized him from behind. A sharp sting burned his shoulder, wasp-like, and a sudden overwhelming lassitude swept him into a darkness deeper than the Arzian night. His last conscious thought was not of his own danger, but of Stryker, asleep and unprotected behind the Marco's open port. He was standing erect when he woke, his back to the open sea and a prismatic glimmer of early dawn rainbow shining on the water before him. For a moment he was totally disoriented. Then from the corner of an eye he caught the pinkish blur of an Arzian fisher standing beside him, and cried out hoarsely in sudden panic when he tried to turn his head, and could not. He was on the coral outcropping offshore, and except for the involuntary muscles of balance and respiration, his body was paralyzed. The first red glow of sunrise blurred the reflected rainbow at his feet, but for some seconds his shuttling mind was too busy to consider the danger of predicament. "Whatever brought me here anesthetized me first," he thought. "That sting in my shoulder was like a hypo needle." Panic seized him again when he remembered the green flying lizards. More seconds passed before he gained control of himself, sweating with the effort. He had to get help. If he could switch on the Audicom at his belt and call Stryker. He bent every ounce of his will toward raising his right hand, and failed. His arm was like a limb of lead, its inertia too great to budge. He relaxed the effort with a groan, sweating again when he saw a fiery half-disk of sun on the water, edges blurred and distorted by tiny surface ripples. On shore he could see the Marco IV resting between thorn forest and beach, its silvered sides glistening with dew. The port was still open, and the empty carrier rack in the bow told him that Gibson had not yet returned with the scouter. He grew aware then that sensation was returning to him slowly, that the cold surface of the Audicom unit at his hip, unfelt before, was pressing against the inner curve of his elbow. He bent his will again toward motion. This time the arm tensed a little, enough to send hope flaring through him. If he could put pressure enough against the stud... The tiny click of its engaging sent him faint with relief. "Striker!" he yelled. "Lee, roll out! Striker!" The Audicom hummed gently without answer. He gathered himself for another shout, and recalled with a chill of horror the tablets Striker had mixed into his nightcap the night before. Worn out by his work, Striker had made certain that he would not be easily disturbed. The flattened sun disk on the water brightened and grew rounder. Above its reflected glare he caught a flicker of movement, a restless suggestion of flapping wings. He tried again. "Striker, help me! I'm on the islet!" The Audicom crackled. The voice that answered was not Striker's but Gibson's. "Farrell, what the devil are you doing on that butcher's block?" Farrell fought down an insane desire to laugh. "Never mind that! Get here fast, Gib! The flying lizards!" He broke off, seeing for the first time the octopods that ringed the outcrop just under the surface of the water, waiting with barbed tentacles spread and yellow eyes studying him glassily. He heard the unmistakable flapping of wings behind and above him then, and thought with shock-born lucidity, "I wanted a backstage look at this show, and now I'm one of the cast." The scouter roared in from the west across the thorn forest, flashing so close above his head that he felt the wind of its passage. Almost instantly he heard the shrilling blast of its emergency bow jets as Gibson met the lizard swarm head-on. Gibson's voice came tinnily from the Audicom. "Scattered them for the moment, Arthur. Blinded the whole crew with the exhaust, I think. Stand fast now. I'm going to pick you up." The scouter settled on the outcrop beside Farrell, so close that the hot wash of its exhaust gases scorched his bare legs. Gibson put out thick brown arms and hauled him inside like a straw man, ignoring the native. The scouter darted for shore with Farrell lying across Gibson's knees in the cockpit, his head hanging half overside. Farrell had a last dizzy glimpse of the islet against the rush of green water below, and felt his shaky laugh of relief stick in his throat. 2 of the octopods were swimming strongly for shore, holding the rigid Arzian native carefully above water between them. "Gib," Farrell croaked. "Gib, can you risk a look back? I think I've gone mad." The scouter swerved briefly as Gibson looked back. "You're all right, Arthur. Just hang on tight. I'll explain everything when we get you safe in the Marco." Farrell forced himself to relax, more relieved than alarmed by the painful pricking of returning sensation. "I might have known it, damn you," he said. "You found your lost city, didn't you?" Gibson sounded a little disgusted, as if he were still angry with himself over some private stupidity. "I'd have found it sooner if I'd had any brains. It was underwater, of course." In the Marco 4, Gibson routed Striker out of his cubicle and mixed drinks around, leaving Farrell comfortably relaxed in the padded control chair. The paralysis was still wearing off slowly, easing Farrell's fear of being permanently disabled. "We never saw the city from the scouter because we didn't go high enough," Gibson said. "I realized that finally, remembering how they used high-altitude blimps during the first wars to spot submarines, and when I took the scouter up far enough, there it was, at the ocean bottom, a city to compare with anything men ever built." Striker stared. "A marine city? What use would sea creatures have for buildings?" "None," Gibson said. "I think the city must have been built ages ago, by men or by a man-like race judging from the architecture, and was submerged later by a sinking of land masses that killed off the original builders and left ours nothing but an oversized archipelago. The squids took over then, and from all appearances they've developed a culture of their own." "I don't see it," Striker complained, shaking his head. "The pink fishers are cattle or less," Gibson finished. The octopods are the dominant race, and they're so far above Fifth Order that we're completely out of bounds here. Under Terran regulations, we can't colonize Arz. It would be armed invasion. Invasion of a squid world? Farrell protested, baffled. Why should surface colonization conflict with an undersea culture, Gib? Why couldn't we share the planet? Because the octopods own the islands too and keep them policed, Gibson said patiently. They even own the pink fishes. It was one of the squid people making a dry land canvas of his preserve here to pick a couple of victims for this morning's show that carried you off last night. Behold a familiar pattern shaping up, Stryker said. He laughed suddenly, a great irrepressible bellow of sound. Ours is a squid's world, Arthur, don't you see? And like most civilized people, they're sportsmen. The flying lizards are the game they hunt, and they raise the pink fishes for... Farrell swore in astonishment. Then those poor devils are put out there deliberately, like worms on a hook, angling in reverse. No wonder I couldn't spot their motivation. Gibson got up and sealed the port, shutting out the soft morning breeze. Colonization being out of the question, we may as well move on before the octopods get curious enough about us to make trouble. Do you feel up to the acceleration, Arthur? Farrell and Stryker looked at each other, grinning. Farrell said, You don't think I want to stick here and be used for bait again, do you? He and Stryker were still grinning over it when Gibson, unamused, blasted the Marco IV free of Arz. The God Next Door by Bill Doede. Narrated by William Skye. The sand thing was powerful, lonely, and strange. No doubt it was a god, but who wasn't? Stinson lay still in the sand where he fell, gloating over the success of his arrival. He touched the pencil-lined scar behind his ear where the cylinder was buried, marveling at the power stored there, power to fling him from Earth to this fourth planet of the Centaurian system in an instant. It had happened so fast that he could almost feel the warm, humid Missouri air, though he was light years from Missouri. He got up. A grey, funnel-shaped cloud of dust stood off to his left. This became disturbing since there was scarcely enough wind to move his hair. He watched it, trying to recall what he might know about cyclones. But he knew little. Weather control made cyclones and other climatic phenomena on Earth practically non-existent. The cloud did not move, though, except to spin on its axis rapidly, emitting a high-pitched, scarcely audible whine like a high-speed motor. He judged it harmless. He stood on a wide valley floor between two mountain ranges. Dark clouds capped one peak of the mountains on his left. The sky was deep blue. He tested the gravity by jumping up and down. Same as Earth gravity. The sun? No, not the sun. Not Sol. What should he call it? Alpha or Centaurus? Well, perhaps neither. He was here, and Earth was somewhere up there. This was the sun of this particular solar system. He was right the first time. The sun burned fiercely, although he would have said it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon if this had been Earth. Not a tree, nor a bush, nor even a wisp of dry grass was in sight. Everywhere was desert. The funnel of sand had moved closer, and while he watched it, it seemed to drift in the wind, although there was no wind. Stinson backed away. It stopped. It was about 10 feet tall by 3 feet in diameter at the base. Then Stinson backed away again. It was changing. Now it became a blue rectangle, then a red cube, a violet sphere. He wanted to run. He wished Benjamin were here. Ben might have an explanation. "What am I afraid of?" he said aloud. A few grains of sand blowing in the wind? A wind devil?" He turned his back and walked away. When he looked up, the wind devil was there before him. He looked back. Only one. It had moved. The sun shone obliquely, throwing Stinson's shadow upon the sand. The wind devil also had a shadow, although the sun shone through it and the shadow was faint. But it moved when the funnel moved. This was no illusion. Again Stinson felt the urge to run or to use the cylinder to project himself somewhere else, but he said, "No," very firmly to himself. He was here to investigate, to determine if this planet was capable of supporting life. Life? Intelligence? He examined the wind devil as closely as he dared, but it was composed only of grains of sand. There was no core, no central place you could point to and say, here is the brain or the nervous system. But then how could a group of loosely spaced grains of sand possibly have a nervous system? It was again going through its paces. Triangle, cube, rectangle, sphere. He watched, and when it became a triangle again, he smoothed a place in the sand and drew a triangle with his forefinger. When it changed to a cube, he drew a square, a circle for a sphere, and so on. When the symbols were repeated, he pointed to each in turn, excitement mounting. He became so absorbed in doing this that he failed to notice how the wind devil drew closer and closer, but when he inhaled the first grains of sand, the realization of what was happening dawned with a flash of fear. Instantly he projected himself 1,000 miles away. Now he was in an area of profuse vegetation. It was twilight. As he stood beside a small creek, a chill wind blew from the northwest. He wanted to cover himself with the long leaves he found, but they were dry and brittle, for here autumn had turned the leaves. Night would be cold. He was not a woodsman. He doubted if he could build a fire without matches. So he followed the creek to where it flowed between two great hills. Steam vapors rose from a crevice. A cave was nearby and warm air flowed from its mouth. He went inside. At first he thought the cave was small, but found instead that he was in a long, narrow passageway. The current of warm air flowed toward him, and he followed it cautiously, stepping carefully and slowly. Then it was not quite so dark. Soon he stepped out of the narrow passageway into a great cavern with a high vaulted ceiling. The light source was a mystery. He left no shadow on the floor. A great crystal sphere hung from the ceiling, and he was curious about its purpose, but a great pool of steaming water in the center of the cavern drew his attention. He went close to warm himself. A stone wall surrounding the pool was inscribed with intricate artwork and indecipherable symbols. Life. Intelligence. The planet was inhabited. Should he give up and return to Earth, or was there room here for his people? Warming his hands there over the great steaming pool, he thought of Benjamin and Strauss and Jameson, all those to whom he had given cylinders and who were now struggling for life against those who desired them. He decided it would not be just to give up so easily. The wide plaza between the pool and cavern wall was smooth as polished glass. Statues lined the wall. He examined them. The unknown artist had been clever. From one angle they were animals, from another birds, from a third they were vaguely humanoid creatures, glowering at him with primitive ferocity. The fourth view was so shocking he had to turn away quickly. No definable form or sculptured line was visible, yet he felt or saw, he did not know which senses told him, the immeasurable gulf of 1,000,000 years of painful evolution. Then nothing. It was not a curtain drawn to prevent him from seeing more. There was no more. He stumbled toward the pool's wall and clutched for support, but his knees buckled. His hand slid down the wall over the ancient inscriptions. He sank to the floor. Before he lost consciousness, he wondered fleetingly if a lethal instrument was in the statue. He woke with a ringing in his ears, feeling drugged and sluggish. Sounds came to him. He opened his eyes. The cavern was crowded. These creatures were not only humanoid, but definitely human, although more slight of build than Earth people. The only difference he could see at first sight was that they had webbed feet. All were dressed from the waist down only, in a shimmering skirt that sparkled as they moved. They walked with the grace of ballet dancers, moving about the plaza, conversing in a musical language with no meaning for Stinson. The men were dark-skinned, the women somewhat lighter, with long flowing hair, wide lips, and a beauty that was utterly sensual. He was in chains. They were small chains, lightweight, of a metal that looked like aluminium, but all his strength could not break them. They saw him struggling. 2 of the men came over and spoke to him in the musical language. "My name is Stinson," he said, pointing to himself. "I'm from the planet Earth." They looked at each other and jabbered some more. "Look," he said. "Earth. E-A-R-T-H. Earth." He pointed upward, described a large circle, then another smaller, and showed how Earth revolved around the sun. One of the men poked him with a stick or tube of some kind. It did not hurt, but angered him. He left the chains by his own method of travel and reappeared behind the 2 men. They stared at the place where he had been. The chains tinkled musically. He grasped the shoulder of the offender, spun him round, and slapped his face. A cry of consternation rose from the group, echoing in the high-ceilinged cavern. "Zbutl!" it said. "Zbutl! Zbutl! Zbutl!" The men instantly prostrated themselves before him. The one who had poked Stinson with the stick rose and handed it to him. Still angered, Stinson grasped it firmly with half a notion to break it over his head. As he did so, a flash of blue fire sprang from it. The man disappeared. A small cloud of dust settled slowly to the floor. Disintegrated. Stinson's face drained pale, and suddenly, unaccountably, he was ashamed because he had no clothes. "I didn't mean to kill him," he cried. "I was angry and—" Useless. They could not understand. For all he knew, they might think he was threatening them. The object he had thought of as a stick was in reality a long metal tube, precisely machined, with a small button near one end. This weapon was completely out of place in a culture such as this. Or was it? What did he know of these people? Very little. They were humanoid. They had exhibited human emotions of anger, fear, and that most human of all characteristics, curiosity. But up to now, the tube and the chain was the only evidence of an advanced technology, unless the ancient inscriptions in the stone wall of the pool and the statues lining the wall were evidences. There was a stirring among the crowd. An object like a pallet was brought, carried by 4 of the women. They laid it at his feet and gestured for him to sit. He touched it cautiously, then sat. Instantly he sprang to his feet. There at the cavern entrance, the wind devil writhed and undulated in a brilliant harmony of colours. It remained in one spot, though, and he relaxed somewhat. One of the women came toward him, long golden hair flowing, firm breasts dipping slightly at each step. Her eyes held a language all their own, universal. She pressed her body against him and bore him to the pallet, her kisses fire on his face. Incongruously, he thought of Benjamin back on Earth and all the others with cylinders who might be fighting for their lives at this moment. He pushed her roughly aside. She spoke, and he understood. Her words were still the same gibberish, but now he knew their meaning. Somehow he knew also that the Wind Devil was responsible for his understanding.
"You do not want me," she said sadly. "Then kill me."
"Why should I kill you?" She shrugged her beautiful shoulders.
"It is the way of the gods," she said. "If you do not, then the others will."
He took the tube weapon in his hands, careful not to touch the button. "Don't be afraid. I didn't mean to kill the man. It was an accident. I will protect you." She shook her head.
"One day they will find me alone, and they'll kill me."
"Why?" She shrugged.
"I have not pleased you."
"On the contrary, you have. There is a time and place for everything, though." Suddenly a great voice sounded in the cavern, a voice with no direction. It came from the ceiling, the floor, the walls, the steaming pool. It was in the language of the web-footed people. It was in his own tongue. "No harm must come to this woman. The god with fingers on his feet has decreed this." Those in the cavern looked at the woman with fear and respect. She kissed Stinson's feet. 2 of the men came and gave her a brilliant new skirt. She smiled at him, and he thought he had never seen a more beautiful face. The great bodiless voice sounded again, but those in the cavern went about their activities. They did not hear. "Who are you?" Stinson looked at the Wind Devil, since it could be no one else speaking, and pointed to himself. "Me?"
"Yes."
"I am Stinson, of the planet Earth."
"Yes, I see it in your mind now. You want to live here on this planet."
"Then you must know where I came from and how."
"I do not understand how. You have a body, a physical body composed of atoms. It is impossible to move a physical body from one place to another by a mere thought and a tiny instrument, yet you have done so. You deserted me out in the desert."
"I deserted you?" Stinson cried angrily. "You tried to kill me."
"I was attempting communication. Why should I kill you?"
He was silent a moment, looking at the people in the cavern. "Perhaps because you feared I would become the god of these people in your place." Stinson felt a mental shrug.
"It is of no importance. When they arrived on this planet, I attempted to explain that I was not a god, but the primitive is not deeply buried in them. They soon resorted to emotion rather than reason. It is of no importance."
"I'd hardly call them primitive with such weapons."
"The tube is not of their technology. That is, they did not make it directly. These are the undesirables, the incorrigibles, the nonconformists from the 6th planet. I permit them here because it occupies my time to watch them evolve."
"You should live so long."
"Live?" the Wind Devil said. "Oh, I see your meaning. I'd almost forgotten. You are a strange entity. You travel by a means even I cannot fully understand, yet you speak of time as if some event were about to take place. I believe you think of death. I see your physical body has deteriorated since yesterday. Your body will cease to exist almost as soon as those of the 6th planet peoples. I am most interested in you. You will bring your people and live here."
"I haven't decided. There are these web-footed people who were hostile until they thought I was a god. They have destructive weapons. Also, I don't understand you. I see you as a cone of sand which keeps changing color and configuration. Is it your body? Where do you come from? Is this planet populated with your kind?"
The Wind Devil hesitated. "Where do I originate? It seems I have always been. You see this cavern, the heated pool, the statues, the inscriptions. 500,000 years ago my people were as you, that is, they lived in physical bodies. Our technology surpassed any you have seen. The tube these webfoots use is a toy by comparison. Our scientists found the ultimate nature of physical law. They learned to separate the mind from the body. Then my people set a date. Our entire race was determined to free itself from the confines of the body. The date came.
What happened?
I do not know. I alone exist. I have searched all the levels of time and matter from the very beginning. My people are gone. Sometimes it almost comes to me why they are gone, and this is contrary to the greatest law of all, that an entity once in existence can never cease to exist.
Stinson was silent, thinking of the endless years of searching through the great gulf of time. His eyes caught sight of the woman, reclining now on the pallet. The men had left her and stood in groups, talking, glancing at him, apparently free of their awe and fear already. The woman looked at him, and she was not smiling.
"Please ask the Sand God," she said, "to speak to my people again. Their fear of him does not last. When he is gone, they will probably kill us."
"As for the webfoots," the Wind Devil or Sand God said, "I will destroy them. You and your people will have the entire planet." "Destroy them?" Stinson asked incredulously. "All these people? They have a right to live like anyone else."
"Right? What is it, right? They are entities. They exist, therefore they always will. My people are the only entities who ever died. To kill the body is unimportant."
"No, you misunderstand. Listen, you spoke of the greatest law. Your law is a scientific hypothesis. It has to do with what comes after physical existence, not with existence itself. The greatest law is this, that an entity, once existing, must not be harmed in any way. To do so changes the most basic structure of nature." The Sand God did not reply. The great bodiless, directionless voice was silent, and Stinson felt as if he had been taken from some high place and set down in a dark canyon. The cone of sand was the color of wood ashes. It pulsed erratically like a great heart missing a beat now and then. The web-footed people milled about restlessly. The woman's eyes pleaded. When he looked back, the Sand God was gone. Instantly, a new note rose in the cavern. The murmur of unmistakable mob fury ran over the webfoots. Several of the men approached the woman with hatred in their voices. He could not understand the words now. But he understood her.
"They'll kill me," she cried.
Stinson pointed the disintegrating weapon at them and yelled. They dropped back. "We'll have to get outside," he told her. "This mob will soon get out of hand. Then the tube won't stop them. They will rush in. I can't kill them all at once, even if I wanted to. And I don't." Together, they edged toward the cavern entrance, ran quickly up the inclined passageway, and came out into crisp, cold air. The morning sun was reflected from a million tiny mirrors on the rocks, the trees, and grass. The silver thaw during the night had covered the whole area with a coating of ice. Stinson shivered. The woman handed him a skirt she had thoughtfully brought along from the cavern. He took it, and they ran down the slippery path leading away from the entrance. From the hiding place behind a large rock they watched as several web-footed men emerged into the sunlight. They blinked, covered their eyes, and jabbered musically among themselves. One slipped and fell on the ice. They re-entered the cave. Stinson donned the shimmering skirt, smiling as he did so. The others should see him now. Benjamin and Strauss and Jamieson. They would laugh, and Ben's wife, Lisa, she would give her little girl laugh and probably help him fasten the skirt. It had a string like a tobacco pouch which was tied around the waist. It helped keep him warm. He turned to the woman. "I don't know what I'll do with you, but now that we're in trouble together, we may as well introduce ourselves. My name is Stinson."
"I am Sibtel," she said. Sibtel. He tried to imitate her musical pronunciation. A very nice name. She smiled, then pointed to the cavern. When the ice is gone, they will come out and follow us. We'd better make tracks. No, she said. We must run and make no tracks. Okay, sis, he said. Sis? That means sister. I am not your sister. I am your wife. What? Yes. When a man protects a woman from harm, it is a sign to all that she is his chosen. Otherwise, why not let her die? You are a strange god. Listen, Sibtel, he said desperately. I am not a god, and you are not my wife. Let's get that straight. But no buts. Right now, we'd better get out of here. He took her hand, and they ran, slid, fell, picked themselves up again, and ran. He doubted the wisdom of keeping her with him. Alone, the Webfoots were no match for him. He could travel instantly to any spot he chose. But with Sibtel it was another matter. He was no better than any other man, perhaps not so good as some because he was 40 and never had been an athlete. How was he to decide if this planet was suitable for his people, hampered by a woman slinking through a frozen wilderness like an Indian? But the woman's hand was soft. He felt strong knowing she depended on him. Anyway, he decided, pursuit was impossible. They left no tracks on the ice. They were safe unless the Webfoots possessed talents unknown to him. So they followed the path leading down from the rocks, along the creek with its tumbling water. Frozen leafless willows clawed at their bodies. The sun shone fiercely in a cloudless sky. Already water ran in tiny rivulets over the ice. The woman steered him to the right, away from the creek. Stinson's bare feet were numb from walking on ice. Christ, he thought, what am I doing here anyway? He glanced down at Sibtel and remembered the Webfoots. He stopped, tempted to use his cylinder and move to a warmer, less dangerous spot. The woman pulled on his arm. We must hurry. He clutched the tube weapon. How many shots in this thing? Shots? How often can I use it? As often as you like. It is good for 50 years. Carter, he is the one you destroyed, brought it from the ship when we came. Many times he has used it unwisely. When did you come? 10 years ago. I was a child. I thought only criminals were brought here. She nodded. Criminals and their children. When will your people come again? She shook her head. Never. They are no longer my people. They have disowned us. And because of me, even those in the cavern have disowned you. Suddenly she stiffened beside him. There, directly in their path, stood the sand god. It was blood red now. It pulsed violently. The great voice burst forth. Leave the woman, it demanded angrily. The Webfoots are nearing your position. I cannot leave her. She is helpless against them. What form of primitive stupidity are you practicing now? Leave or they will kill you. Stinson shook his head. The sand god pulsed more violently than before. Ice melted in a wide area around it. Brown, frozen grass burned to ashes. You will allow them to kill you just to defend her life? What business is it of yours if she lives or dies? My race discarded such primitive logic long before it reached your level of development. Yes, Stinson said, and your race no longer exists. The sand god became a sphere of blue flame. A wave of intense heat drove them backward. Earthman, the great voice said, go back to your Earth. Take your inconsistencies with you. Do not come here again to infect my planet with your primitive ideas. The Webfoots are not as intelligent as you, but they are sane. If you bring your people here, I shall destroy you all.
The sphere of blue fire screamed away across the frozen wilderness, and the thunder of its passing shook the ground and echoed among the lonely hills. Sibtil shivered against his arm.
"The sand god is angry," she said. "My people tell how he was angry once before when we first came here. He killed half of us and burned the ship that brought us. That is how Carter got the tube weapon. It was the only thing the sand god didn't burn, that and the skirts. Then, when he had burned the ship, the sand god went to the 6th planet and burned 2 of the largest cities as a warning that no more of us must come here."
"Well," Stinson said to himself, "that does it. We're better off on Earth. We can't fight a monster like him."
Sibtil touched his arm. "Why did the sand god come? He did not speak."
"He spoke to me."
"I did not hear."
"Yes, I know now. His voice sounds like thunder in the sky, but it is a voice that speaks only in the mind. He said I must leave this planet."
She glanced at him with suddenly awakened eyes, as if thinking of it for the first time. "Where is your ship?"
"I have no ship."
"Then he will kill you." She touched her fingers on his face. "I am sorry. It was all for me."
"Don't worry. The sand god travels without a ship. Why shouldn't I?"
"Now?"
"As soon as you are safe. Come." Steam rose from the burned area, charred like a rocket launching pit. They stepped around it carefully. Stinson felt warm air, but there was no time now to warm cold feet or dwell on the vagaries of sand gods. Together they crossed the narrow valley. Sibtil led him toward a tall mound of rock. Here they came to the creek again, which flowed into a small canyon. They climbed the canyon wall. Far away, small figures moved. The Webfoots were on their trail. She drew him into a small cave. It was heated, like the great cavern, but held no walled pool nor mysterious lighting. But it was warm, and the small entrance made an excellent vantage point for warding off attack.
"They will not find us."
A high-pitched keening burst suddenly around them. Stinson knew they had heard or felt the sound for some time, that now its frequency was in an audible range.
"The sand god," Sibtil said. "Sometimes he plays among the clouds. He makes it rain in a dry summer, or sometimes warms the whole world for days at a time in winter, so the snow melts and the grass begins to green. Then he tires and lets winter come back again. He is the loneliest god in the universe."
"What makes you think he's lonely?"
She shrugged her shoulders. "I just know. But he's an angry god now. See those clouds piling in the east? Soon they will hide the sun. Then he will make them churn and boil like river whirlpools in spring. At least he does this when he plays. Who knows what he will do when he's angry?"
"The sand god isn't doing this," Stinson said. "It's only a storm."
She covered his lips with her fingers. "Don't say that. He may hear you and be more angry."
"But it is, don't you see? You give him powers he does not possess."
Sibtil shook her head and stroked his face with her long, slim fingers. "Poor little god with fingers on his feet," she said. "You do not understand. The sand god is terrible even when he plays. See the lightning? It is blue. The lightning of a storm that comes by itself is not blue. He is running around the world on feet like the rockets of spaceships, and when he strikes the clouds, blue fire shoots away."
The clouds continued to build on one another. Soon the blue flashes of lightning extended across the sky from horizon to horizon. The earth trembled. Sibtil moved closer, trembling also.
"He never did this before," she said. "He never made the earth shake before."
Great boulders crashed down the canyon walls and dropped into the creek. They dared not move from the cave, although death seemed certain if they stayed. I'll leave for a moment, he said. I'll be back soon.
You're leaving? There was panic in her voice.
Only for a moment.
And you won't come back? You will go to your world?
No, I'll be back.
Promise? No, don't promise. The promises of gods often are forgotten before the sounds die away.
I'll be back. He disappeared at once, giving her no chance to object again, and went to the desert of sand where he had first arrived on the planet. He wanted to see if the storm were worldwide. Stinson had never been in a sandstorm before, even on Earth. He could not breathe. He could not see. Bullets of sand stung his skin. Bullets of sand shot into his eyes. Clouds of sand howled around him. He fell, and the wind rolled over him over and over in the sand like a tumbleweed. The skirt flew up around his face. He could not get up again. He returned to the cave. Soon after, while they sat huddled together watching the chaos of tumbling rocks, lightning, and driving rain, the high-pitched keening came again. A sphere of blue fire appeared in the east. Its brilliance put the lightning to shame. It bore down on the cave swiftly, purposefully. Stinson prepared himself to leave. In spite of his desire to protect Sibtel, it was useless to get himself killed when he was powerless to help her. But at the last moment, it veered off. "Fiend!" Stinson screamed the word, vaguely marveling at his own fury. The blue sphere turned and came back. "Monster!" Again. "Murderer! Adolescent!" This time it kept going. The rain and wind ceased. Lightning stopped. Thunder rumbled distantly. Clouds disappeared. Stinson and Sibtel emerged from the cave. There was no longer a question of attack from the Webfoots. The storm had taken care of that. The fierce sun began its work of drying rocks and throwing shadows and coaxing life out into the open again. Down in the canyon, a bird sang, a lonely, cheerful twitter.
"The sand god is tired," Sibtel said. "He is not angry now. I'm glad. Perhaps he will let you stay."
"No. Even if he allowed it, I couldn't stay. My people could never live here with a god who is half devil." The cone of sand suddenly appeared. It stood in the canyon, its base on a level with the cave. It was quiet. It was dull grey in color. It exuded impressions of death, of hopeful words solemnly spoken over lowered coffins, of cold earth and cold space, of dank, wet catacombs, of creeping, crawling nether things. The bird's twitter stopped abruptly. "Earthman," the sand god said, as if he were about to make a statement. Stinson ignored him. He glanced down at Sibtel, who sensed that this was a time for goodbyes. He thought, perhaps I can stay here alone with her. The Webfoots might find us, or the sand god might destroy us in one of his fits, but it might be worth it.
"Don't go," she said. "Not yet."
"Earthman, hear me." "I hear you."
"Why does your mind shrink backward?"
"I've decided not to bring my people here."
"You decided?"
"Certainly," Stinson said boldly. "Call it rationalization if you wish. You ordered us away, and I have several good reasons for not coming here if the door was open."
"I've changed my mind. You will be welcomed."
"Listen to that, will you?" Stinson said angrily. "Just listen. You set yourself up as a god for the Webfoots. You get them eating out of your hand. Then what do? You throw a fit. Yes, a fit. Like an adolescent. Worse."
"Earthman, wait."
"No," Stinson shot back. "You've owned this planet for 1,000,000 years. You have brooded here alone since before my people discovered fire, and in all those ages you never learned self-control. I can't subject my people to the whims of an entity who throws a planetary fit when it pleases him." Stinson relaxed.
He'd had his say. Sibtel trembled beside him. A small mammal, round, furry, hopped by, sniffing inquisitively. Sibtel said, "Is the sand god happy?" She shook her head. "No, he is not happy. He is old, old, old. I can feel it. My people say that when one gets too old it is well to die. But gods never die, do they? I would not like to be a god." "Stinson," the sand god said, "you said I was adolescent. You are correct. Do you remember I told you how my people, the entire race, left their bodies at the same time? Do you imagine all of us were adults?"
"I suppose not. Sounds reasonable. How old were you?"
"Chronologically, by our standards, I was 9 years old."
"But you continued to develop after—"
"No."
Stinson tried to imagine it. At first there must have been a single voice crying into a monstrous emptiness.
"Mother, where are you? Mother! Where is everyone?"
A frenzied searching of the planet, the solar system, the galaxy. Then a returning to the planet. Empty. Change. Buildings, roads, bridges weathering slowly. Such a race would have built of durable metal. Durable? Centuries, eons passed. Buildings crumbled to dust, dust blew away. Bridges eroded, fell, decomposed into basic elements. The shape of constellations changed. All trace of civilization passed except in the cavern of the heated pool. Constellations disappeared, new patterns formed in the night sky. The unutterably total void of time, 500,000 years. And a 9-year-old child brooding over an empty world. "I don't understand why your development stopped," Stinson said.
"Nor do I. But perhaps, well, I sensed that I would continue if you brought your people here. You have already taught me the value of life. There is a oneness, a bond that ties each living thing to every other living thing. It is a lesson my people never knew. Select any portion of this planet that suits you. Take the web-footed woman for your wife. Have children. I promise never to harm you in any way."
"The Webfoots?"
"You and they shall share the planet."
The sand god disappeared. Sibtel said,
"Is the sand god angry again?"
"No, he is not angry."
"I'm glad. You will leave now?"
"No. This is my home." She laughed softly.
"You are a strange god."
"Listen," he said. "I am not a god. Get that through your head." She drew him into the cave. Her lips were cool and sweet. The cave was pleasantly warm. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button so the video spreads and the channel grows. Thanks. Spawning Ground by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. They weren't human. They were something more, and something less. They were, in short, humanity's hopes for survival. The starship Pandora creaked and groaned as her landing pad settled unevenly in the mucky surface of the ugly world outside. She seemed to be restless to end her fool's errand here, 200 light-years from the waiting hordes on Earth. Straining metal plates twanged and echoed through her hallways. Captain Gwaine cursed and rolled over, reaching for his boots. He was a big, raw-boned man, barely 40, but 10 years of responsibility had pressed down his shoulders and put age-feigning hollows under his reddened eyes. The star lanes between Earth and her potential colonies were rough on the men who travelled them now. He shuffled toward the control room, grumbling at the heavy gravity. Lieutenant Jane Corey looked up, nodding a blonde head at him as he moved toward the ever-waiting pot of murky coffee.
"Morning, Bob. You need a shave."
"Yeah." He swallowed the hot coffee without tasting it, then ran a hand across the dark stubble on his chin. It could wait. "Anything new during the night?"
"About a dozen blobs held something like a convention a little ways north of us. They broke up about an hour ago and streaked off into the clouds."
The blobs were a peculiarity of this planet about which nobody knew anything. They looked like overgrown fireballs, but seemed to have an almost sentient curiosity about anything moving on the ground.
"And our 2 cadets sneaked out again. Barker followed them but lost them in the murk. I've kept a signal going to guide them back."
Gawain swore softly to himself. Earth couldn't turn out enough starmen in the schools, so promising kids were being shipped out for training as cadets on their 12th birthday. The 2 he'd drawn, Kaufman and Pinelli, seemed to be totally devoid of any sense of caution. Of course, there was no obvious need for caution here. The blobs hadn't seemed dangerous, and the local animals were apparently all herbivorous and harmless. They were ugly enough, looking like insects in spite of their internal skeletons, with anywhere from 4 to 12 legs each on their segmented bodies. None acted like dangerous beasts. But something had happened to the exploration party 15 years back, and to the more recent ship under Hennessy that was sent to check up. He turned to the port to stare out at the planet. The Sol-type sun must be rising, since there was a dim light. But the thick clouds that wrapped the entire world diffused its rays into a haze. For a change, it wasn't raining, though the ground was covered by thick swirls of fog. In the distance, the tops of shrubs that made a scrub forest glowed yellow-green. Motions around them suggested a herd of feeding animals. Details were impossible to see through the haze. Even the deep gorge where they'd found Hennessy's carefully buried ship was completely hidden by the fog. There were 3 of the blobs dancing about over the grazing animals now, as they often seemed to do. Gawain stared at them for a minute, trying to read sense into the things. If he had time to study them. But there was no time. Earth had ordered him to detour here after leading his load of deep-sleep stored colonists on official World 71 to check on any sign of Hennessy. He'd been here a week longer than he should have stayed already. If there was no sign in another day or so of what had happened to the men who'd deserted their ship and its equipment, he'd have to report back. He would have left before if a recent landslip hadn't exposed enough of the buried ship for his metal locators to spot from the air by luck. It had obviously been hidden deep enough to foil the detectors originally.
"Bob!" Jane Corey's voice cut through his pondering. "Bob, there are the kids!"
Before he could swing to follow her pointing finger, movement caught his eye. The blobs had left the herd. Now the 3 were streaking at fantastic speed to a spot near the ship, to hover excitedly above something that moved there. He saw the 2 cadets then, heading back to the waiting ship, just beyond the movement he'd seen through the mist. Whatever was making the fog swirl must have reached higher ground. Something began to heave upwards. It was too far to see clearly, but Gawain grabbed the microphone, yelling into the radio toward the cadets. They must have seen whatever it was just as the call reached them. Young Kaufman grabbed at Pinelli, and they swung around together. Then the mists cleared. Under the dancing blobs, a horde of things was heading for the cadets. Shaggy heads, brute bodies vaguely man-like. One seemed to be almost 8 feet tall, leading the others directly toward the spacesuited cadets. Some of the horde were carrying spears or sticks. There was a momentary halt, and then the leader lifted one arm, as if motioning the others forward. "Get the jeeps out!" Gawain yelled at Jane. He yanked the door of the little officer's lift open and jabbed down the button. It was agonizingly slow, but faster than climbing down. He ripped the door back at the exit deck. Men were dashing in, stumbling around in confusion. But someone was taking over now, one of the crew women. The jeeps were lining up. One, at the front, was stuttering into life, and Gawain dashed for it as the exit port slid back. There was no time for suits or helmets. The air on the planet was irritating and vile-smelling, but it could be breathed. He leaped to the seat to see that the driver was Dr. Barker. At a gesture, the jeep rolled down the ramp, grinding its gears into second as it picked up speed. The other two followed. There was no sign of the cadets at first. Then Gawain spotted them, surrounded by the menacing horde. Seen from here, the things looked horrible in a travesty of manhood. The huge leader suddenly waved and pointed toward the jeeps that were racing toward him. He made a fantastic leap backwards. Others swung about, two of them grabbing up the cadets. The jeep was doing 20 miles an hour now, but the horde began to increase the distance, in spite of the load of the two struggling boys. The creatures dived downward into the lower ground, beginning to disappear into the mists. "Follow the blobs!" Gawain yelled. He realized now he'd been a fool to leave his suit. The radio would have let him keep in contact with the kids. But it was too late to go back. The blobs danced after the horde. Barker bounced the jeep downward into a gorge. Somewhere the man had learned to drive superlatively, but he had to slow as the fog thickened lower down. Then it cleared to show the mob of creatures doubling back on their own trail to confuse the pursuers. There was no time to stop. The jeep ploughed through them. Gawain had a glimpse of 5-foot bodies tumbling out of the way. Monstrously coarse faces were half hidden by thick hair. A spear crunched against the windshield from behind, and Gawain caught it before it could foul the steering wheel. It had a wickedly beautiful point of stone. The creatures vanished as Barker fought to turn to follow them. The other jeeps were coming up, by the sound of their motors, but too late to help. They'd have to get to the group with the cadets in a hurry, or the horde would all vanish in the uneven ground, hidden by the fog. A blob dropped down, almost touching Gawain. He threw up an instinctive hand. There was a tingling as the creature seemed to pass around it. It lifted a few inches and drifted off. Abruptly, Barker's foot grounded the brake. Gawain jolted forward against the windshield just as he made out the form of the 8-foot leader. The thing was standing directly ahead of him, a cadet on each shoulder. The wheels locked, and the jeep slid protestingly forward. The creature leaped back, but Gawain was out of the jeep before it stopped, diving for the figure. It dropped the boys with a surprised grunt. The arms were thin and grotesque below the massively distorted shoulders, but amazingly strong. Gawain felt them wrench at him as his hands locked on the thick throat. A stench of alien flesh was in his nose as the thing fell backwards. Doc Barker had hit it seconds after the captain's attack. Its head hit rocky ground with a dull, heavy sound, and it collapsed. Gawain eased back slowly, but it made no further move, though it was still breathing. Another jeep had drawn up, and men were examining the cadets. Pinelli was either laughing or crying, and Kaufman was trying to break free to kick at the monster. But neither had been harmed. The two were loaded onto a jeep, while men helped Barker and Gawain stow the bound monster on another before heading back. "No sign of skull fracture. My God, what a tough brute!" Barker shook his own head, as if feeling the shock of the monster's landing. "I hope so," Gawain told him. "I want that thing to live, and you're detailed to save it and revive it. Find out if it can make sign language or draw pictures. I want to know what happened to Hennessy and why that ship was buried against detection. This thing may be the answer." Barker nodded grimly. "I'll try, though I can't risk drugs on an alien metabolism." He sucked in on the cigarette he'd dug out, then spat sickly. Smoke and this air made a foul combination. "Bob, it still makes no sense. We've scoured this planet by infrared, and there was no sign of native villages or culture. We should have found some." "Troglodytes, maybe," Gawain guessed. Anyhow, send for me when you get anything. I've got to get this ship back to Earth. We're overstaying our time here already. The reports from the cadets were satisfactory enough. They'd been picked up and carried, but no harm had been done them. Now they were busy being little heroes. Gawain sentenced them to quarters as soon as he could, knowing their stories would only get wilder and less informative with retelling. If they could get any story from the captured creature, they might save time and be better off than trying to dig through Hennessy's ship. That was almost certainly sporeless by now. The only possible answer seemed to be that the exploring expedition and Hennessy's rescue group had been overcome by the aliens. It was an answer, but it left a lot of questions. How could the primitives have gotten to the men inside Hennessy's ship? Why was its fuel dumped? Only men would have known how to do that. And who told these creatures that a spaceship's metal finders could be fooled by a little more than 100 feet of solid rock? They'd buried the ship cunningly, and only the accidental slippage had undone their work. Maybe there would never be a full answer, but he had to find something, and find it fast. Earth needed every world she could make remotely habitable, or mankind was probably doomed to extinction. The race had blundered safely through its discovery of atomic weapons into a peace that had lasted 200 years. It had managed to prevent an interplanetary war with the Venus colonists. It had found a drive that led to the stars, and hadn't even found intelligent life there to be dangerous on the few worlds that had cultures of their own. But 40 years ago, observations from beyond the solar system had finally proved that the sun was going to go nova. It wouldn't be much of an explosion, as such things go, but it would render the whole solar system uninhabitable for millennia. To survive, man had to colonize. And there were no worlds perfect for him, as Earth had been. The explorers went out in desperation to find what they could. The terraforming teams did what they could. And then the big starships began filling worlds with colonists, carried in deep sleep to conserve space. Almost 80 worlds. The nearest a 4-month journey from Earth and 4 more months back. In another 10 years the sun would explode, leaving man only on the footholds he was trying to dig among other solar systems. Maybe some of the strange worlds would let men spread his seed again. Maybe none would be spawning grounds for mankind in spite of the efforts. Each was precious as a haven for the race. If this world could be used, it would be nearer than most. If not, as it now seemed, no more time could be wasted here. Primitives could be overcome, maybe. It would be ruthless and unfair to strip them of their world, but the first law was survival. But how could primitives do what these must have done? He studied the spear he had salvaged. It was on a staff made of cemented bits of smaller wood from the scrub growth, skillfully laminated. The point was of delicately chipped flint, done as no human hand had been able to do for centuries. "Beautiful primitive work," he muttered. Jane pulled the coffee cup away from her lips and snorted. "You can see a lot more of it out there," she suggested. He went to the port and glanced out. About 60 of the things were squatting in the clearing fog, holding lances and staring at the ship. They were perhaps 1,000 yards away, waiting patiently. For what? For the return of their leader? Or for something that would give the ship to them? Gawain grabbed the phone and called Barker. "How's the captive coming?" Barker's voice sounded odd. "Physically fine. You can see him, but..." Gawain dropped the phone and headed for the little sick bay. He swore at Doc for not calling him at once, and then at himself for not checking up sooner. Then he stopped at the sound of voices. There was the end of a question from Barker, and a thick, harsh growling sound that lifted the hair along the nape of Gawain's neck. Barker seemed to understand, and was making a comment as the captain dashed in. The captive was sitting on the bunk, unbound and oddly unmenacing. The thick features were relaxed and yet somehow intent. He seemed to make some kind of a salute as he saw Gawain enter, and his eyes burned up unerringly toward the device on the officer's cap. "Haru Kaban," the thing said. "Captain Gawain, may I present your former friend, Captain Hennessy?" Barker said. There was a grin on the doctor's lips, but his face was taut with strain. The creature nodded slowly and drew something from the thick hair on its head. It was the golden comet of a captain. "He never meant to hurt the kids, just to talk to them," Barker cut in quickly. "I've got some of the story. He's changed. He can't talk very well. Says they've had to change the language around to make the sounds fit, and he's forgotten how to use what normal English he can. But it gets easier as you listen. It's Hennessy, all right, I'm certain." Gawain had his own ideas on that. It was easy for an alien to seize on the gold ornament of a captive Earthman, even to learn a little English, maybe. But Hennessy had been his friend. "How many barmaids in the Cheshire Cat? How many pups did your oldest kid's dog have? How many were brown?" The lips contorted into something vaguely like a smile, and the curiously shaped fingers that could handle no human-designed equipment spread out. 3, 7, 0. The answers were right. By the time the session was over, Gawain had begun to understand the twisted speech from inhuman vocal cords better. But the story took a long time telling. When it was finished, Gawain and Barker sat for long minutes in silence. Finally, Gawain drew up a shuddering breath and stood up. "Is it possible, Doc?" "No," Barker said flatly. He spread his hands and grimaced. "No, not by what I know. But it happened. I've looked at a few tissues under the microscope. The changes are there. It's hard to believe about their kids. Adults in 8 years, but they stay shorter. It can't be a hereditary change. The things that affect the body don't change the germplasm. But in this case, what changed Hennessy is real, so maybe the fact that the change is passed on is as real as he claims." Gawain led the former Hennessy to the exit. The waiting blobs dropped down to touch the monstrous man, then leaped up again. The crowd of monsters began moving forward toward their leader. A few were almost as tall as Hennessy, but most were not more than 5 feet high. The kids of the exploring party. Back in the control room, Gawain found the emergency release levers, set the combinations, and pressed the studs. There was a hiss and gurgle as the great tanks of fuel discharged their contents out onto the ground, where no ingenuity could ever recover it to bring life to the ship again. He'd have to tell the men and women of the crew later, after he'd had time to organize things and present it all in a way they could accept, however much they might hate it at first. But there was no putting off giving the gist of it to Jane. "It was the blobs," he summarized it. "They seem to be amused by men. They don't require anything from us, but they like us around. Hennessy doesn't know why. They can change our cells, adapt us. Before men came, all life here had 12 legs. Now they're changing that, as we've seen. And they don't have to be close to do it. We've all been outside the hull. It doesn't show yet, but we're changed. In another month, Earth food would kill us. We've got to stay here. We'll bury the ships deeper this time, and Earth won't find us. They can't risk trying a colony where 3 ships vanish, so we'll just disappear, and they'll never know." Nobody would know. Their children, odd children who matured in 8 years, would be primitive savages in 3 generations. The Earth tools would be useless, impossible for the hands so radically changed. Nothing from the ship would last. Books could never be read by the new eyes. And in time, Earth wouldn't even be a memory to this world. She was silent a long time, staring out of the port toward what must now be her home. Then she sighed. "You'll need practice,
but the others don't know you as well as I do, Bob. I guess we can fix it so they'll believe it all. And it's too late now. But we haven't really been changed yet, have we?
No, he admitted.
Damn his voice. He'd never been good at lying.
No, they have to touch us. I've been touched, but the rest could go back.
She nodded. He waited for the condemnation, but there was only puzzlement in her face. Why? And then, before he could answer, her own intelligence gave her the same answer he had found for himself. The spawning ground. It was the only thing they could do. Earth needed a place to plant her seed, but no world other than Earth could ever be trusted to preserve that seed for generation after generation. Some worlds already were becoming uncertain. Here, though, the blobs had adapted men to the alien world instead of men having to adapt the whole planet to their needs. Here, the strange children of man's race could grow, develop, and begin the long trek back to civilization. The gadgets would be lost for a time, but perhaps some of the attitudes of civilized man would remain to make the next rise to culture a better one.
We're needed here, he told her, his voice pleading for the understanding he couldn't yet fully give himself. These people need as rich a set of bloodlines as possible to give the new race strength. The 50 men and women on this ship will be needed to start them with a decent chance. We can't go to Earth, where nobody would believe or accept the idea, or even let us come back. We have to stay here. She smiled then, and moved toward him, groping for his strength. Be fruitful, she whispered. Be fruitful and spawn and replenish an Earth. No, he told her. Replenish the stars. But she was no longer listening, and that part of his idea could wait. Some day, though, their children would find a way to the star lanes again, looking for other worlds. With the blobs to help them, they could adapt to most worlds. The unchanged spirit would lead them through all space, and the changing bodies would claim worlds beyond numbering. Some day, the whole universe would be a spawning ground for the children of men. Survival Factor by Charles V. DeVette. Narrated by William Skye. They were trapped on a viciously primitive planet by an electronic bloodhound that was viciously unpredictable. The survey team was 7 parsecs beyond the rim when the bloodhound picked up their trail. 3 years later, the inevitable had happened. The humans of the 10,000 worlds had met another race with faster-than-light space drive and an expanding population. The contacts had been brief and violent. Each race had set up defenses against the other and maneuvered for position and control of the habitable world separating them. The aliens' bloodhounds formed the outer circle of their defense perimeter. The S-tracer continued its bleak chirping as Wallace read the figures on its dial and made a swift calculation. "We have time for one dip into space bridge," he informed Saxton, the other member of the team. "If we don't find a planet fast when we come out, we've had it." Saxton nodded. "We'd better backtrack. Set the bridge for that star group we recorded yesterday. Hurry, we haven't any time to spare." 4 minutes later, Wallace brought the 2 handles of the bridge control together and the ship winked into hyperspace. Wallace's body jerked upright and he sat stiff and straight, fighting the impulse to retch that rode his stomach muscles. The room around him took on the visual consistency of thin milk. The low hum of the ship's instruments increased in intensity through the hands that he pressed tightly to his head. Mingled with the sound of the small motors was Saxton's high-strained muttering. "I can't take any more of it! I can't take any more of it!" Then all was normal again. They were out of hyperspace. Wallace reached for a knob on the board in front of him and began turning it slowly. Both men watched the vision panel on the front wall. After a minute, a blue globe floated in from one side. "We'll have to try that one," Wallace said. "It at least has atmosphere." "We don't have any choice," Saxton answered. With his head, he indicated the S-tracer. Its stark chirping had begun again. "The hound's closer than I thought," Wallace complained. "We'll have to risk a faster passage to the surface than would ordinarily be safe." Drops of perspiration that had gathered on his forehead joined together and ran down the side of his nose. He shook his head to clear them away. By the time they entered the blue planet's atmosphere, the intervals between the chirps of the S-tracer had shortened until now they were almost continuous. Gradually, as they plunged toward the planet's surface, the room's temperature rose. They stripped to their shorts and kept the pace steady. When it seemed that they could stand the heat no longer, the ship paused and settled slowly to the ground. Quickly, Wallace shut off the drive motors. The only sound within the ship was the purring of the cooling apparatus. "Any chance that it can detect our cooling motor?" Saxton asked. "I don't believe it can follow anything smaller than our main drive," Wallace answered. He pointed to the S-tracer. "It's already lost us. Of course, we know it won't go away. It'll circle the planet until we come out and try again." During the next hour, as the temperature within the ship returned slowly to normal, Wallace and Saxton kept busy checking the gauges that measured and recorded the elements in the planet's atmosphere. At last, Saxton sighed heavily. "Livable," he said. "Closer to Earth norm than we could have hoped," Wallace agreed. "What do we do now?" "We could stay here for 2 years until the Bloodhound runs out of fuel. That's the estimated time it's supplied for." "That doesn't sound like a very encouraging prospect." Saxton's dark tan features were lined with worry. "We don't have food enough for one thing. Maybe the aliens will get discouraged and go away." "Hardly. You've forgotten that the Bloodhounds are fully automatic and unmanned. A machine doesn't discourage very easily." "We sure as heck ought to be able to outwit a machine," Saxton said. He thought for a moment. "If we waited until it was across the planet from us, we might have time to get out and take another jump toward home. One more and we'd be far enough in so our own cruisers could take care of the Bloodhound." Wallace shook his head. "Its speed is too great. Our best chance is that it doesn't hold to a straight path around the planet. The aliens, not knowing the size of any body we might land on, wouldn't set it for a deadline trajectory. I hope." There was nothing for them to do until the S-tracer had followed the movements of their stalker long enough to make an adequate graph. They decided to go outside while they waited. Wallace and Saxton took only a few steps and stopped in amazement. They had a visitor. The native rose from his kneeling position on the ground and stood erect. Wallace studied the face of the naked, stick-thin savage, trying to penetrate beneath the dirt and grime, beneath the mask of impassive features, to find the quality that held him in questioning immobility. For a moment he succeeded. It was not high intelligence that he found, but rather an innate conviction of power. A conviction and self-assurance so deep that it needed no demonstration for expression. Wallace glanced at Saxton where he leaned against the spaceship's ramp, the whites of his eyes contrasting sharply with the black of his clean skin. It was clear that he too sensed the odd quality in the other, and that he was equally unable to decide whether the savage that so incuriously regarded first one then the other of them was to be feared or accepted as amicable. But both already realized that this was no ordinary meeting between humans and an outworld native. They were on the verge of an unusual experience. The savage had been kneeling with his forehead touching the ground when they stepped out of the ship. However, now that he stood before them, there was nothing abject in his demeanor. For a long minute he did not speak or make any motion other than to regard them. Casually then he raised his right hand and touched his chest. "Alfin," he said. The meaning of the gesture was apparent. Wallace readily understood that the savage was giving his name. He touched his own chest. "Ivan," he murmured. The native turned his gaze to Saxton. "Gas," Saxton said, shifting his feet uncomfortably. The native nodded. "Come," he commanded. He turned his back and walked away. There was no question in Wallace's mind about obeying. It was only his subconscious that moved his hand to make certain that his gun was in its holster, and to glance at Saxton to see that he too was armed. He had walked several yards before the incongruity struck him. The savage had spoken Earthian. They followed the native for several miles over a faint game trail that wound leisurely through brush and skimpy small-leaved trees before either of the men recovered his composure enough to speak.
"He said come," Saxton mused. "Yet we're the first humans this far over the rim. Where did he learn our language?"
Wallace shrugged.
"I've been wondering too," he answered.
"Should we try to talk to him?" Saxton asked, glancing ahead at their companion. The native apparently had no interest in their conversation.
"Better wait,"
Wallace suggested.
"I don't understand it." Saxton's tone was querulous. "No one's allowed over the rim ahead of us. A section has to be surveyed and worlds declared fit for habitation before colonists can move in. Yet we land here and find a native speaking our language."
"Perhaps he isn't a native," Wallace said.
"What do you mean?"
"When Earth first discovered Spacebridge, there were no laws regulating its use. Limits were put on colonizing areas only after some of the earlier expeditions failed to report back. One of them might have been marooned here."
"Then this fellow's human?"
"He could be."
"If he is, would he be naked?" Saxton asked.
"Some of those lost expeditions disappeared as long as 2,000 years ago," Wallace answered. "A colony could have slipped back a long ways in that time."
"But not this far," Saxton demurred. "They'd still have some traces of their original culture left."
"A one-ship colony would have very limited mechanical resources," Wallace said, "and they'd be isolated here. As soon as the tools and machines they brought with them wore out, they'd be almost impossible to replace. The odds are they'd slip back fast."
"I don't know."
Clearly Saxton wasn't satisfied, but he let the subject hang.
"When we saw him kneeling on the ground, I thought that he was worshipping us. But since then he's been acting as if he thought he was the god instead of us."
They were halfway across a small clearing now, and before Wallace could answer, the native ahead stopped abruptly. He stood motionless with his head tilted to one side, as though listening. After a moment he motioned them to move to the left. As Wallace and Saxton obeyed, Alfin pointed urgently toward their guns. They drew, and the native turned to stare at the bushes at the far side of the clearing.
"What does he want?"
"I don't—" Wallace's answer was cut off as a huge cat with long stilt-like legs spread wide sprang out of the bushes directly at them. Wallace and Saxton sprayed the beams of their guns across the cat's chest, burning a wide, smoking gash. The beast landed, sprang again, and died. Saxton let out a long breath of relief. "Close," he said. Wallace stood with a puzzled frown on his face.
"How did he know the animal was there?" he asked.
"He must have a good sense of hearing," Saxton answered doubtfully.
"It can't be that good," Wallace protested.
"Maybe this is our chance to get some fresh meat," Saxton said. He drew a knife from his belt and knelt beside the cat's carcass. He made several rapid cuts. After a minute, he looked up. "Nothing edible," he said. "Nothing but skin, gristle, and tendons." They walked on. They entered another clearing and found themselves in the midst of a group of naked savages, obviously Alfin's people.
"Where did they come from?"
Saxton asked, resting his hand on the grip of his gun. Wallace looked his way and shook his head. "No guns," he said. "We'll have to take the chance that they're friendly." Most of the members of the group, Wallace observed, were lying on the ground or idling about at the edges of the small clearing. He counted 23, of both sexes and varying ages. There was no sign of clothing or ornament on any of them. They were naked, filthy, and nondescript, yet each had the mark of that quality that had puzzled them in Alfin, the deep inner assurance. A few glanced their way, but without any evidence of an unusual degree of interest. Their attention returned to Alfin. Streaks of sweat had made grey trails on his grimy face, and he gave off an odour that was sharp and rancid. He sat on the ground and motioned for Wallace and Saxton to do the same. Wallace hesitated, then spread his hands resignedly. "This is a strange game," he said. "We'll let him make the first moves." He and Saxton sat down together. Alfin began speaking without inflection and with few pauses. Some of the individual words sounded faintly familiar, but the two men could make no sense of what he said. "I'm afraid we can't understand you," Wallace told him. In an aside to Saxton, he said, "He won't understand me either, but I don't think we'd better ignore him." Saxton nodded. "I guess you are right about his being human," he said. "Some of those words were definitely Earthian." Alfin raised his voice in a shout. "Ilma!" One of the women in the centre of the clearing laughed and came toward them. She was stick-thin, as were Alfin and most of the others, and very dirty. As she came near, she smiled. Her teeth were discoloured and rotting. She giggled. Alfin indicated her with a sweep of his arm. "Mate?" he inquired. Wallace felt himself reddening. "Is he offering her to us?" he asked Saxton. "I think so." Saxton smiled uneasily. "It looks like it's our move now." "We'll have to risk offending them." Wallace looked at Alfin and shook his head vigorously. "No, mate," he said. The woman giggled again and walked away. Alfin seemed to have lost interest. He pulled himself jerkily to his feet and went across the clearing to the fire that the two surveyors had noted earlier. A large clay kettle rested on a flat rock over the fire. "There's meat in that kettle," Saxton said, whimsically licking his lips. "I hope he passes some around." "I don't think we should eat any," Wallace cautioned. "Why not?" "You know the saying, one man's meat." "But I'm starved for fresh meat," Saxton argued. "We'll see if we can get him to give us some," Wallace said. "We can take it back to the ship and test it before we eat any." They watched Alfin as he dug in the kettle with a stick and placed the food he speared on a large leaf. He carried it to where an old man sat with his back resting against a tree trunk. The hoary veteran had a long scar on his right arm that ran from shoulder to elbow. Evidently he had had a brush with one of the big cats some time in the past. Oddly enough, he was the only native that was not thin and hungry looking. "He must be the chief," Saxton said. "At least he's well fed." Wallace nodded. When Alfin returned, Saxton said, "Meat." At the same time, he rubbed his stomach in a circular motion. Alfin paused, thinking over what Saxton had said, then nodded several times. He made a gesture with his arm for them to follow, and led them to the fat old man. "Meat," Alfin intoned expressionlessly, and stood as though waiting for the old man's reply. "I hope he's in a generous mood," Saxton said. They had seen no sign from the old man, but Alfin turned to them and nodded once more. "Meat," he said. He made no further move. "Why doesn't he get it?" Saxton asked finally. "Apparently he agrees, but he just stands there." "Maybe we're supposed to do something now," Wallace said. "But what? Do you suppose we're expected to pay him some way?" "That could be," Saxton answered. "Or maybe the chief's eating the last of what they have now, and they'll give us a chunk when they get some more. Anyway, let's not wait any longer. I'm starved. Even canned concentrate would taste good to me now." By morning, the S-Tracer had marked the tracking chart sufficiently to give them some data on the Bloodhound's actions. Wallace went over it carefully. Saxton stayed in his bunk and pretended to be still sleepy, but Wallace could feel his gaze following the work closely. When at last he looked up, Saxton said, "Well?" "We have something to work on," Wallace answered the question in his voice. "But unless we get more, I don't see how it will help us." "The Bloodhound," he went on, not waiting for further inquiry from Saxton, "is acting pretty much as we thought it would. It has no straight-line trajectory. At irregular intervals it circles, backtracks, or goes off at a new tangent. Often it stays over a particular territory for longer than the 3 hours we'd need to get away. It's probable that at some time it will do this on the other side of the planet, where it couldn't pick up the signal of our leaving, but... Saxton was sitting up now. But what? It's following a random pattern. Wallace studied his fingernails as he sought for words to make the explanation clear. The S-tracer will show us when it is out of range, but there's no way for us to know how long it will stay in any one place. In other words, there will be intervals when it will be directly across the planet from us, but unless it stayed there for close to 3 hours, the time we'd need to clear the atmosphere, it would pick up our signal as it came around and run us down. That's about it. Then we'll have to take the chance. We could, and if we can think of nothing better, we will. But the odds would be heavily against us. Most of its locale changes are made in a shorter period of time than we'd need to get away. We can't sit here for 2 years. Saxton was a man whose high-strung nature demanded action and was the more inclined of the two to take chances. Wallace preferred weighing influencing factors before making any decision. I think we'd better wait, Wallace said. Perhaps we'll be able to think of something that will give us a better chance. Saxton pulled the sheet blanket off his legs irritably and climbed from the bunk, but he did not argue. During the morning, Saxton killed a small rodent but found its flesh as inedible as that of the cat. Wallace stayed inside studying the charts and instruments. They had their noonday meal in a small clearing by the side of the ship. Wallace had been able to find no way of solving their difficulty. For want of a better plan, they decided to wait while keeping close track of their stalker. I've been thinking about those natives, Wallace said as they lay stretched on the grass. If they are lost colonists, have you wondered how they managed to survive here so long? I did wonder how they protected themselves against the cats, Saxton answered. They don't seem to have any weapons. Alfin demonstrated that they must have exceptionally good hearing, Wallace said. But would that be enough? You'd think the cats would get them when they're sleeping, if not during the day, or kill off their young. That's what I meant, Saxton said. We saw no weapons, so they must have some other means of defence. They live pretty much like animals, Wallace observed. Maybe they stay alive the same way. If animals aren't powerful, they're usually swift. Or they have some other survival characteristics, such as prolific propagation. But what do these savages have, except perhaps the sharp hearing that you mentioned? That alone shouldn't be a deciding factor. Yet they were able to survive here for 2,000 years. How about an instinct of dispersal? Saxton asked. There might be hundreds of groups like the one we saw. That would help. But my thought was that if they don't use weapons, they might have gone at it from another angle. They adjusted themselves instead of their tools to their environment. Special ability stuff? Saxton asked. Wallace glanced over at the other man. By the look of abstraction on Saxton's face, he knew that no answer was necessary. Saxton's imagination was a moving force. When a subject intrigued him, he could no more abandon it and turn to something else than he could stop breathing. The trait was one that made him an ideal partner for Wallace, with his more logical reasoning and his insistence on weighing fact against fact and belief against belief. It was, in fact, the reason the two men had been teamed. One was the intuitive, the other the harmonizing, controlling factor in their combination. Saxton rose and stretched. I think I'll go inside, he said. I want to poke around in the library a while. Wallace smiled and followed his companion into the ship. This at least would take Saxton's mind off their troubles. Their enforced inactivity would be less tedious for the more imaginative man. Saxton selected several tapes from the bookshelf and put them in the magnifier. When I find something that sounds likely, he said, I'll read it. Stop me if you want to discuss anything I find. A half-hour later, Saxton said, Socrates maintained that the fewer our needs, the nearer we resemble gods. Do you suppose Alfin and his tribe are approaching godhood? Wallace's answer from the bunk where he lay was a discourteous grunt. I thought so too, Saxton quipped. He went on reading. Almost an hour went by before he spoke again. This might help put our savages in the proper place in their cycle, he said. Quote, Giambattista Vica, a native of Naples, held a theory that human history progressed in cycles, each of which followed the same course. The first move in a civilization began when man, terrified by the forces of nature, invented and worshipped gods in order to placate them. Next, he made up myths of demigods and heroes and arrived at the idea of kingship. Finally, from kingship he came to democracy, which degenerated into chaos, after which the next cycle started and the process was repeated.
Interesting, Wallace said, but even if it fits, I think we understand well enough where these people are in their cycle. What we want now is a clue as to what makes them different.
Wallace was about to doze off when Saxton said, "Listen to this. In which he first injected the hormone that produces milk in the breasts of nursing mothers into the bloodstream of starved virgin rats, and then introduced newly hatched squabs into their cages. Instead of devouring the luscious meal placed before them, the starved virgin animals acted as tender foster mothers to the helpless creatures." He looked across at Wallace expectantly.
"I'm afraid I don't," Wallace began.
"Don't you see?" Saxton asked. "Something about the food here has made the natives different. We've got to find that food."
"That might be true also," Wallace answered slowly, "but I'm not as interested in finding what caused the difference as I am in finding the difference itself."
"Find one and you find the other," Saxton argued. He held up his hand as Wallace made as though to speak. "Sleep on it," he said. "Maybe we'll have some ideas by tomorrow." They were able to extract no new clues from the tracking of the bloodhound by the next forenoon. Neither man could arrive at any means of thwarting the alien machine. Wallace had checked the graph track minutely, looking for signs of a cycle or cycles in its movements. He ended up convinced that none existed. It apparently operated entirely at random. At the midday meal, Saxton suggested, "Let's pay those fellows in the woods another visit."
"We may as well," Wallace agreed. "We're helpless here until we can come up with some new idea."
They finished eating and strapped on their sidearms. They were not certain that the path they took through the woods was the same they had taken with Alfin 2 days before, but at least it led in the same general direction. An hour later, they were lost. Their way had not led them to the tribe of naked savages, and they had no idea where else to look. They were debating whether or not to return to their ship when they stepped out into a clearing, one larger than any they had come on earlier. In the center of the clearing rested a spaceship. From where they stood they could see that its hull was rusted and weather-beaten. "That hasn't flown in a long time," Saxton said after the first few minutes of wonder.
"Probably not since it first landed here," Wallace answered.
The clearing about the vessel had been kept free of brush and bushes, and when they went across and through the open portal of the ship, they found the inside immaculate. "They certainly keep it clean," Saxton observed.
"It may be a shrine to them," Wallace said. "That would explain why we found Alfin kneeling when we landed, and yet why he treated us so nonchalantly. He was worshipping our ship, not us."
"I hope they don't find us here," Saxton remarked. "We might be violating some taboo." Most of the interior fittings of the vessel, they found, had long ago rotted away. Only the metal parts still remained intact. The instrument board was unfamiliar to them.
"Pretty definitely an early model," Wallace said.
Saxton found something on one wall that held his absorbed interest. "Come here, Ivan," he called.
"What is it?"
Wallace asked, going over to stand beside him. "Read that." Wallace read aloud from the engraved plaque.
"Spring 2676. We, the Doukhobors, leave our earth homes in the hope that we may find a dwelling place for ourselves and our children, where we may worship our God as we believe proper. We place ourselves in his hands and pray that he will watch over us on our journey and in the time to come."
"That's over 1900 years ago," Saxton said.
"Soon after the discovery of Spacebridge," Wallace added.
Without being aware of it, they both spoke in whispers. They inspected the vessel for some time more, but found little of any further interest. A short time after they left the ancient spaceship, Wallace and Saxton stumbled on Alfin and his group of naked natives. This time they made a concerted effort to communicate with Alfin and one or two of the others, but with no more success than before. Neither side could understand more than a few words of the other's language, and they could accomplish very little with signs. Alfin sat with them for a time until they saw him tilt his head in the gesture they remembered. On his face was the same expression of listening. After a moment, he rose leisurely and indicated that they were to follow him. Most of the other natives, Wallace noted on rising, had already gone over and bunched together at one end of the clearing. They appeared restless, but not frightened. "What's it all about?" Saxton asked. "I suspect there's another cat in the neighbourhood," Wallace answered. Saxton pointed to the centre of the clearing. Beneath a tree, the oldster with the scar on his arm sat alone, seemingly unaware that the others had left him. "Are they using their chief for a decoy?" Saxton asked. "Perhaps the old duffer isn't the chief," Wallace answered. He reached for his firearm. A dirt-encrusted hand closed over his own. He looked up. Alfin shook his head. Wallace turned to look back at the clearing just in time to see a big cat step out of the bushes. It glanced across at them with an easy hate in its red-shot eyes and turned its attention to the fat man who was nearer. Slowly, it gathered itself to spring. Wallace shrugged off Alfin's hand that still rested on his, just as the cat left its feet. He had no chance to fire. The cat finished its spring, and the ground caved in beneath its feet. A moment later they heard it snarling and spitting from several yards underground. Calmly, unhurriedly, the natives picked boulders from the ground and carried them to the pit. They dropped or threw them down on the cat until its snarls changed from anger to pain and died completely. Wallace and Saxton walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. The cat was dead. Its carcass lay sprawled over those of another dozen of its kind. "Evidently they've used this method before," Wallace remarked. A thought occurred to him, and he looked at Saxton. Saxton nodded in unspoken agreement. "We've just seen another demonstration of that ability we're trying to find," he said. "But what is it?" Wallace asked. "Can it be anything except acute hearing?" "If it was only that, how did they know where the cat would appear and what it would do? If it had circled the pit, they would have been helpless. Yet they did nothing except retreat to the far side of the clearing and wait." Saxton shook his head in defeat. "They did act with plenty of assurance, but how did they know? Do you think we should stay around some more and watch how they operate?" Wallace glanced up at the rapidly moving sun. "We'd better get back to the ship," he said. "We have only about enough time to reach it before dark. We can come back again tomorrow if you want." That evening, as he lay on his bunk, Wallace noted that Saxton was growing restless again. Their being unable to find a way to evade the bloodhound was bringing the irritable part of his nature to the surface. The time had come again to furnish diversion. "I'm sure we have all the clues on those savages," he said, "if we just understood how to fit them together." It worked. Saxton stopped pacing and bared his teeth in a smile. "You still think they developed some special ability, don't you?" he asked. "I don't agree. 1900 years, the time the colony's been here, is too short for any change to take place. Evolution doesn't work that fast." "I'm not thinking of the slow process of adaptation," Wallace said, "where the most fit and their descendants are the ones that tend to survive and propagate. What I had in mind was a form of genetic change, such as a plant or an animal appearing that is different from the rest of its species. A botanist or a biologist would call it a sport, like the appearance of a black rose on a bush of red roses. If the black rose is more fitted to survive in its environment, or if it is artificially propagated, it would soon replace the red." "You think then that a child was born here with a difference that made it more fit to survive in this environment than the others, and that the savages we saw are its direct descendants?" Wallace nodded. "But wouldn't it be too much of a coincidence that the particular trait should appear just when it was needed?" "I don't think so," Wallace said. "Nature has a way of providing the particular trait just at the time it is most needed. A good example is the way more male children are born during a war. There's no known explanation for something like that, but nature seems to know what is needed and provides it." "That sounds plausible," Saxton said after a minute of consideration. According to your theory, then, those savages possess an ability radically different from that of normal humans. Not necessarily radically different, Wallace answered. It would probably be a trait inherent in all of us, but not so evident or fully developed. Or perhaps it has made its appearance before in rare individuals, but not being a survival characteristic where it appeared, it died. Something like telepathy or poltergeism or any of the other so-called wild talents. I'll admit I'm stumped, Saxton said, and I don't think we'll learn anything more here without staying and observing them a lot longer than I'd care to. If we ever get back home, there are specialists in that sort of thing who can do more with the facts we gave them than we can. Wallace sighed. I suppose you're right, he said. I hope we learn what it is before we leave, but of course we can't wait if we get the chance to go. Early the next afternoon they spied a figure hurrying toward them from the edge of the wood. It's Alfin, Saxton said. I wonder why he's in such a hurry. He's carrying something under his arm, Wallace commented. They waited while the native puffed his way up the bank of the small plateau on which the spaceship rested. When he reached them, he stood for a moment, fighting to regain his breath. It was evident that he had run long and hard. Pushing his package under one arm, Alfin raised the other and pointed at the sky. Bringing his arm around in a wide half-circle, he made a sound with his lips like an earth bumblebee. When he reached the end of the half-circle, he held a finger out in a long point. He ended the performance by holding his hand out toward the spaceship and making a scooping motion as though he were throwing it into the air. 3 times he repeated the maneuver. Wallace watched him in puzzled silence. At the end of the 3rd repetition, his eyes widened with slowly dawning understanding. He ran for the portal of the ship. I'll be right back, he tossed over his shoulder. Inside, he glanced quickly at the S-tracer. Its needles indicated that the bloodhound was directly across the planet from them. He dashed back to the open portal. Inside! Quick! He called to Saxton. Saxton wasted not a minute in obeying. As he pushed past Wallace, Alfin came to the portal of the ship. He extended the parcel he had been carrying under his arm to Wallace. Meat, he said. Bye. Thanks, Wallace answered, taking the gift. Thanks for everything. He closed the portal quickly. 3 hours later they were in hyperspace. Another 5 minutes and they were in the 10,000 worlds portion of the galaxy, and safe. Saxon turned over on his side. He had made a faster recovery from the nausea of the bridge than usual. Okay, he said to Wallace. Give. Wallace smiled. Perhaps we'd better open Alfin's gift first, he said, deliberately teasing Saxton with his procrastination. He unwrapped the several large leaves from the package on the table. Inside was a man's fat arm with a long scar running from shoulder joint to elbow. Saxton groaned and dashed for the lavatory. This time he was sicker than he'd been during the jump. When he turned, streaks of pale green showed through the duskiness of his cheeks. They're cannibals, he whispered. I wouldn't hold that against them, Wallace said. It might have been one of the necessities of their survival. I suppose so. Saxton turned intently to Wallace. This much I got, he said. When Alfin said bye, I figured that he was telling us to get out. But how did he know that it would be safe, and how did you know enough to trust him? I can't take too much credit, Wallace said. Just all at once everything clicked together at the exact moment I understood that Alfin was trying to tell us to leave. You remember we decided that their survival characteristic would probably be something inherent in all of us, but not developed, or at least not to the extent that an isolated colony of humans would need here? Saxton nodded. Well, I'm convinced that the answer is intuition. Intuition? Yes, Wallace said. Everyone knows what intuition is and has it to some degree. With no evidence to back up his reasoning, a person knows that something is going to happen. Sometimes he can even give exact details. It's a definite, perceivable faculty, yet no one has ever been able to explain just what it is or even how it works. But if you looked at it in another way, it wouldn't be so mysterious. It's another sense too deeply buried in our subconscious to be consistently active. Those savages needed it here, fully developed, and nature provided it.
Saxton pulled himself up on one elbow. And with it they can practically see what's going to happen in the future, he finished for Wallace. They can predict and be right every time. That's how Alfin knew it would be safe for us to leave. He paused. It all fits. I think you've got it. Wallace smiled. My guess is that they can't see very far into the future. That's why Alfin was out of breath when he came. By the time he learned about the coming opposition of our ship and the aliens, he had to hurry to get to us and tell us before it was too late. Wallace rubbed the stubble of whiskers on his chin with his knuckles. We'll have to report this planet suitable for colonizing, he said. I hate to think what will happen to those poor savages when civilization moves in. They'll soon lose that future seeing. Saxton's eyes widened at some inner thought. He sat straight up in his bunk. Will they? He asked. Or will it work the other way? Some day the children of those naked savages may... He stopped. Wallace recognized the glaze of abstraction that moved over his features. Saxton began to sing a stanza from an old popular song that had recently been revived. There's gonna be some changes made.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. And make sure to head to Substack, where I'm posting the majority of my new stories, 3 per week for free subscribers and bonus content for those who wish to support me as a creator. All emailed to you in one convenient weekly newsletter. Stories from the Sky sff.substack.com is where you need to go, link in the description. See you there!